The air inside St. Raphael Hospital was sterile, filled with the faint scent of antiseptics and the rhythmic beeping of machines. Doctors and nurses bustled down the gleaming hallways, their white coats and scrubs fluttering like banners of dedication. Among them was Dr. Richard Lancaster, one of the hospital's most esteemed surgeons, a man whose reputation for precision in the operating room was only rivaled by his infamously sharp tongue. He was respected, feared, and, by some, silently despised. Richard strode into the hospital lobby, glancing at his watch with a frown. He disliked delays, inefficiency, and, though he never admitted it outright, working with certain kinds of people. His crisp blue scrubs, embroidered with his name and title, marked his authority. As he stepped into the elevator, he barely acknowledged the young nurses who greeted him with wary politeness. Meanwhile, in a different wing of the hospital, Amara Johnson finished prepping for her shift. She was used to the fast pace of the ICU, the long hours, and the emotional toll, but what truly exhausted her was the subtle yet persistent discrimination that clouded her daily life. She had worked hard to get here, fought through barriers that many of her colleagues would never understand, yet she knew some of them still viewed her as an outsider. The whispers, the skeptical glances, the way some doctors doubted her expertise before she even opened her mouth. She had seen Dr. Lancaster's dismissive attitude toward minority nurses before, but she had never worked directly under him until now. The roster had just been posted, and there it was, her name listed under his surgical team. Amara took a deep breath. She had faced worse before. She would face this too. The operating room was bathed in cold fluorescent light, the air thick with the scent of sterilized instruments. The patient, a middle-aged man suffering from a severe abdominal blockage, lay unconscious on the table. The surgical team had assembled, standing at attention as Dr. Richard Lancaster scrubbed in, his every movement deliberate and controlled. "Let's make this quick and clean," he said as he walked in, his voice clipped, his eyes scanning the team. When his gaze landed on Amara, a shadow of irritation flickered across his face. She was standing at the ready, hands clasped, her surgical mask covering the lower half of her face. "You're new to my team," Richard noted, though it wasn't a question. "Yes, Dr. Lancaster," Amara responded evenly. "I've been assigned as your assisting nurse for this procedure." He didn't reply. Instead, he turned toward the anesthesiologist. "Vitals?" As the procedure began, Richard issued orders with practiced efficiency, expecting obedience without question. Amara followed each command precisely, handing him instruments with smooth precision. She anticipated his movements, prepared for every step, yet, no matter how flawless her performance, she could feel his judgment. Then, it happened. A minor complication arose, nothing drastic, but something that required quick action. Richard requested a tool, and Amara reached for it immediately. But a junior nurse, flustered, accidentally bumped the tray. A scalpel clattered to the floor. Richard's eyes snapped up, furious, but instead of addressing the actual culprit, his gaze settled on Amara. "Unacceptable," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "If you can't handle something as simple as passing me an instrument, you don't belong in my OR." Amara stiffened. "Doctor, I don't want to hear excuses." He cut her off sharply. "I need competence in here, not incompetence." The room went silent. The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. The mistake hadn't been hers. Yet she was the one being humiliated. Amara clenched her fists at her sides. She could feel her heart hammering, but she refused to let him see her shaken. The procedure continued, but the tension in the room had thickened. By the time the surgery was completed successfully, the damage had already been done. As Richard stripped off his gloves, he shot one last glance at Amara. "See me in my office after this." Amara's steps were steady as she approached Dr. Lancaster's office, though her pulse betrayed her calm facade. The door was slightly ajar when she reached it, and she knocked once before stepping inside. Richard was already seated behind his desk, reviewing a patient's file, his expression unreadable. "Close the door." His voice was sharp, authoritative. She obeyed. He set the file down and looked at her directly for the first time. "I don't know what kind of training you received before working here, but I expect a certain standard in my operating room." Amara held his gaze, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny. "I understand that, doctor, but with all due respect, The mistake wasn't mine. His expression darkened. Are you implying that I was unfair? Amara chose her words carefully. I'm saying that I executed my role exactly as I was supposed to. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze assessing. Then, with a scoff, he shook his head. I see what this is. She frowned slightly. Excuse me? I've seen it before, he continued, voice laced with condescension. People like you, always quick to play the victim card. Her breath caught for half a second. People like me? She echoed. Richard's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Don't pretend you don't know what I mean. I don't tolerate mediocrity, no matter who it comes from. If you want to survive in this profession, you'd better learn to work twice as hard. That's just reality. Amara clenched her jaw. I have worked twice as hard, she said quietly. I've done everything expected of me and more. I don't need to justify my skills to you. Richard waved a dismissive hand. Save your speeches for someone who cares. There was nothing left to say. Amara turned and walked toward the door. Her shoulders squared, but just as she reached for the handle, Richard's voice rang out once more. If you can't handle the pressure, you should reconsider if this is the right hospital for you. She didn't flinch. Without looking back, she opened the door and stepped out. By the time Amara reached the nurses' station, whispers had already begun to circulate. The hospital had its own way of spreading news, and Richard Lancaster's public rebuke of a black nurse had not gone unnoticed. A few of her colleagues avoided her gaze, either out of discomfort or fear of association. Others, particularly the younger nurses, exchanged glances of quiet outrage. Are you okay? A soft voice broke through her thoughts. It was Marie, one of the senior nurses. Amara nodded stiffly. I'm fine. Marie sighed. You should report him. Amara hesitated. To who? Marie gave her a knowing look. Your father. A long silence stretched between them. Her father, Dr. Alexander Johnson, the hospital's chief medical officer, the man who had dedicated his career to fighting discrimination in medicine. The man who would be furious if he knew what had just happened. Amara exhaled slowly. No, she said firmly. Not yet. Marie nodded, though her expression was doubtful. Then at least watch your back. Amara met her gaze. I always do. And with that, she turned on her heel and walked down the hall, her mind already calculating her next move. Richard Lancaster had made a mistake. He just didn't know it yet. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Dr. Alexander Johnson's office, its golden glow a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He sat behind his large mahogany desk, fingers steepled, his sharp eyes fixed on the woman sitting before him. Drive. Eleanor Brooks, the head of the hospital's ethics committee. Her expression was grim. I thought you should know, Eleanor said, setting down her pen after jotting a final note in her leather-bound planner. Dr. Lancaster berated your daughter today in front of the entire surgical team. And from what I hear, it wasn't just criticism, it was a deliberate attempt to humiliate her. Alexander's fingers tightened slightly. His expression did not change. But Eleanor had known him long enough to recognize the controlled anger simmering beneath the surface. She hasn't filed a formal complaint, Eleanor continued, but this isn't the first time he's shown bias against certain staff members. Alexander exhaled slowly. He had always been proud of Amara for fighting her own battles. She had inherited his stubborn determination, and she had never wanted special treatment simply because of who her father was. But this was different. I appreciate you telling me, he said evenly. Eleanor hesitated before adding, what do you intend to do about it? Alexander leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes narrowing. For now, nothing. Eleanor raised a brow. You're going to let this slide? He shook his head. No, but I want to see how Amara handles it. If I step in too soon, it might make things worse for her. I won't fight her battles, unless she asks me to. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before nodding. Just be careful, Alexander. Lancaster isn't just arrogant, he's dangerous in the way he thinks. Alexander knew that better than anyone. And if Richard Lancaster thought he could mistreat his daughter without consequence, he was sorely mistaken. Richard Lancaster sipped his evening scotch, staring out at the city skyline through the tall windows of his apartment. The faint hum of classical music played in the background, the delicate notes of Chopin filling the air. But despite the calming ambiance, his mind was anything but at ease. The day's events replayed in his head: the surgery, the scalpel incident, the way he had put Amara Johnson in her place. He should have felt satisfied. But instead, he was irritated. She hadn't cowered. She had stood there, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance, refusing to accept his authority unquestioningly. That bothered him more than it should. He had always prided himself on his objectivity, on the idea that he judged people by their merit, not by their background. Yet deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. He had been raised in a household that viewed people like Amara as inferior. His father, an old-school surgeon from another era, had ingrained in him the idea that medicine was a white man's profession. And even though society had changed, Richard's core beliefs had not. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. He sighed and set his glass down. When he opened the door, he found Dr. Mark Harrington, one of his few close colleagues, standing there with a raised brow. "You look like hell," Mark said, stepping inside. "What's got you in a bad mood?" Richard poured another drink. "It's that nurse, Johnson." Mark frowned. "What about her?" "She's insubordinate, overconfident, thinks she belongs on my surgical team." He took a long sip before adding, "I don't trust her." Mark studied him for a moment. "And why is that, Richard?" Richard scowled. "Because she's not qualified." Mark crossed his arms. "She graduated at the top of her class, has glowing recommendations, and is one of the best damn nurses in this hospital." Richard set his glass down with a sharp clink. "That doesn't mean I have to like working with her." Mark sighed. "Be careful, Richard. You're walking a dangerous line." Richard scoffed. "Please, what's she going to do? Complain to her daddy?" Mark didn't respond, but the silence said more than words ever could. The soft hum of medical equipment surrounded Amara as she finished checking the vitals of a post-op patient. The hospital was quieter now. Most of the high-stakes surgeries had concluded, and the night shift was slowly taking over. She had just finished updating a patient's chart when her phone vibrated. A single message appeared. "Come to my office when you're free, Dad." A part of her had expected this. She set down the chart, took a deep breath, and made her way to the administrative wing. When she entered, her father was standing by the window, arms crossed. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then he sighed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Amara exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't want you to get involved." Alexander nodded, though his expression remained serious. "I respect that, but I need to know, are you okay?" She hesitated before answering. "I'm frustrated, but I'll handle it." His gaze softened. "You shouldn't have to handle this alone." She gave him a small smile. "I know, but I want to. If I let you fight my battles, people will just say I got where I am because of you." Alexander sighed. "You know Lancaster won't stop, right?" "I know. And if it gets worse?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I'll deal with it." Her father studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'll give you space, but if he crosses the line again, you come to me." "I will." He knew she was lying, and she knew that he knew. The morning sun had barely risen when Richard Lancaster strode into the hospital. His usual air of self-importance wrapped around him like an expensive coat. Today's surgery was a complicated vascular procedure, one that required precision and teamwork. But there was one problem. He had specifically requested that Amara Johnson not be assigned to his team. Instead, he had chosen Lillian Matthews, a young, relatively inexperienced nurse who had only recently been promoted to the surgical floor. The first half of the procedure went smoothly. But then, a mistake. As Richard worked carefully to suture a delicate artery, he called for a specific instrument. Lillian, flustered, hesitated before handing him the wrong one. "No, the other clamp. I need the DeBakey, not the Kelly," he snapped. Lillian's hands trembled. She reached for the right tool, but her hesitation cost them precious seconds. "Damn it, Matthews, hurry up." By the time she corrected the mistake, the damage was already done. A slight tear in the vessel had occurred, a dangerous complication. The patient's vitals began to drop. Richard cursed under his breath. This should have never happened. "Somebody get me Johnson." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Minutes later, Amara rushed into the operating room. She barely spared Richard a glance before assessing the situation. Her hands moved with expert precision, her instructions clear and confident. Within moments, she had stabilized the bleeding, controlling the damage that had nearly cost the patient their life. The surgery continued, but Richard barely spoke another word. When it was over, he stripped off his gloves. Jaw tight. Amara had just saved his patient. And he hated that more than anything. The silence in the operating room stretched long after the last suture had been placed. The surgical team moved efficiently, closing the sterile field and ensuring the patient was stable before transferring them to recovery. Richard Lancaster stripped off his gloves, his mind still processing the events of the last hour. He could feel the weight of his own mistake pressing down on him like a vice. He had insisted on replacing Amara Johnson with someone else, someone less experienced. He had prioritized his own personal biases over the safety of his patient. And the result? A near disaster. His lips pressed into a thin line as he looked across the room at Amara, who was methodically finishing up post-op procedures with her usual competence. There was no arrogance in her expression, no smugness over the fact that she had been the one to save the patient after his error. She didn't even look at him. That irritated him even more. Richard wasn't used to being wrong. In fact, he hated being wrong. And yet, in front of the entire surgical team, he had just demonstrated, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that his judgment had been flawed. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. As he exited the OR, his footsteps were heavy. He could feel the glances of his colleagues as he walked down the hall. Some of them pitied him. Others looked at him with something akin to disappointment. He barely made it into his office before slamming the door shut. This couldn't happen again. It wouldn't happen again. Except, deep down, a small voice whispered something he didn't want to acknowledge. It already had. Alexander Johnson did not like making rash decisions. He had built his career on discipline, calculated actions, and an unshakable sense of justice. But when he received reports, multiple reports, from hospital staff about what had transpired in the OR that morning, he knew it was time to act. He summoned Richard Lancaster to his office without delay. Richard arrived with his usual air of self-importance, his posture rigid and his expression neutral. But Alexander wasn't fooled. He could see the slight tension in the surgeon's shoulders, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. "Sit," Alexander said, his tone clipped. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering himself into the chair across from the hospital director. There was a long pause as Alexander studied him, allowing the silence to stretch until it became unbearable. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "I assume this is about today's surgery." "You assume correctly," Alexander replied, his voice unreadable. He leaned forward, folding his hands together on the desk. "Do you have any idea how serious your actions were this morning?" Richard bristled. "The patient is stable. Because of my daughter," Alexander said sharply. His voice didn't rise, but there was a quiet, simmering anger beneath it. "You made a reckless decision based on personal prejudice. And if it weren't for Amara stepping in, that patient could have died. This is not a matter of opinion, Dr. Lancaster. This is fact." Richard clenched his jaw. "I take full responsibility for the misjudgment." "Do you?" Alexander cut him off. "Because I don't think you do. I think you're standing here, telling yourself that this was just an unfortunate coincidence. That if the mistake had been made by someone else, it would have been different." Richard's silence was telling. Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "You have an excellent track record, Dr. Lancaster. That's the only reason I haven't dismissed you on the spot. But make no mistake, this will not happen again." Richard met his gaze, his blue eyes cold. "And if it does? Then I will personally ensure that you are no longer employed at this hospital." Alexander said without hesitation, "Your skills may be exceptional, but your arrogance and prejudice have no place in this institution." For the first time, Richard Lancaster had no response. And for the first time, he felt the weight of something he had never experienced before. Consequences. Amara hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. She had known, of course, that her father would eventually step in. But hearing from colleagues that Dr. Lancaster had been summoned to the director's office was something else entirely. She had been going over patient charts when Marie approached her in the break room, her expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "You should have seen his face when he walked in," Marie said, stirring her coffee. "He looked like he wanted to murder someone." Amara exhaled, setting her tablet down. "I don't want this to become a personal war." Marie gave her a knowing look. "Sweetheart, it already is." She wasn't wrong. Amara had spent years in this field knowing she had to prove herself twice as much as others. That was the reality of being both a woman and black in medicine. But now, her battle wasn't just about her. It was about every other nurse, doctor, and medical professional who had ever been belittled, doubted, or pushed aside because of bias. And that realization steeled her resolve. If Lancaster thought he could bully her into leaving, he was about to be sorely mistaken. She wasn't going anywhere. Richard hadn't slept well. The conversation with Amara Johnson replayed in his mind on an endless loop. Like a haunting refrain that wouldn't fade. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. He had always been untouchable. He was the best in his field. A surgeon who had saved hundreds of lives. People respected him, feared him, and yet, one mistake, one moment of misplaced arrogance, had nearly cost him everything. His grip on his control was slipping. When he walked into the hospital the next morning, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. People were watching him differently. Not with admiration or deference, but with something else. Scrutiny. Mistrust. It gnawed at him. In the past, when he entered the OR, there was an unspoken reverence for his presence. Now, when he stepped into a meeting with the surgical team, he could feel the lingering tension in the air. He saw the way the younger doctors whispered when they thought he wasn't looking. He noticed how some nurses hesitated before addressing him. And worst of all, he saw Amara Johnson standing tall among them. Her confidence unwavering. She had won the respect he had once commanded. And he hated it. For the first time in his career, Richard Lancaster was beginning to understand what it felt like to be on the losing side. Richard Lancaster had always believed in his own invincibility. For years, his name had been synonymous with excellence. A surgeon whose skills had saved countless lives. But now, he felt something creeping up his spine, something unfamiliar. Doubt. He walked through the hospital halls, sensing the shift in the way people looked at him. It wasn't respect anymore. It was something else. He could hear the murmurs as he passed by groups of nurses. Feel the careful distance some of the junior doctors maintained. The worst part? The surgical team he once commanded with absolute authority now seemed hesitant around him. It wasn't hard to pinpoint the moment everything had changed. The operating room failure, the hospital director's warning, and Amara Johnson. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would fade into the background. Let his words crush her into submission. Instead, she had thrived. She had proven him wrong. And he could feel the consequences like a slow burning fire under his skin. At first, he told himself it would pass. People forgot scandals quickly. But as the days stretched into a week, the atmosphere in St. Raphael Hospital remained tense. And then, the final blow came. The hospital board had scheduled a mandatory ethics and bias training session, a direct result of his actions. For the first time in his career, Richard was being forced to confront something he had spent a lifetime ignoring. The training session was held in the hospital's largest conference room, the rows of seats filled with doctors, nurses, and administrators. Richard sat near the back, arms crossed, his jaw tight as he listened to the speaker, a well-respected medical ethics professor, discuss systemic bias in healthcare. Every statistic, every case study, every example felt like an attack. He could feel Amara's presence 3 rows ahead. Her posture straight, her attention unwavering. She belonged here. The realization irritated him. The speaker called for personal anecdotes from the staff, inviting them to share experiences of bias in the workplace. A young black resident stood up. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I remember a time when I was in medical school," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an old hurt. "One of my professors told me I was too aggressive when answering questions in class. But when my white classmates did the same thing, they were praised for being ambitious." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Another nurse shared her story. Then another. And then Amara stood. The room fell silent. She didn't look at Richard directly. She didn't need to. "When I first started at St. Raphael, I told myself I wouldn't let anyone make me feel like I didn't belong," she said. "But I learned quickly that belonging isn't always something you get to decide for yourself. Someone else decides it for you. They decide if you're worthy, if you're competent, if you deserve respect." Her voice didn't shake. "And sometimes, no matter how hard you work, no matter how skilled you are, there will always be someone who looks at you and only sees what they expect to see." Richard stared at his hands. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Richard sat alone in his office, the glow from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The echoes of Amara's words from the ethics session still rang in his ears. He had spent his entire career believing he was superior, that his way was the only way. But what if he had been wrong? The thought unsettled him. A sharp knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. He expected it to be a hospital board member, or maybe even Alexander Johnson, ready to issue yet another warning. But it wasn't. It was Amara. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without waiting for permission, she stepped inside and shut the door behind her. "You don't like me," she said plainly. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I wouldn't put it that way. You don't have to." Her voice was calm, but there was something unyielding beneath it. "You think I don't belong here. You think I'm not as capable as my white colleagues. And that's your bias to deal with. Not mine." Richard stiffened. "I never said that. You didn't have to," Amara replied. She took a step forward. And for the first time, Richard saw not just defiance but conviction. "I'm not here for an apology," she said. "I don't need one. What I need is for you to understand that the way you treat people matters. That your words have weight. That when you undermine someone not because of their skill but because of your own assumptions, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting your patients, your colleagues, your entire profession." Richard didn't respond. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not because she had yelled at him, not because she had insulted him, but because she was right. And he hated that he hadn't seen it sooner. Amara studied him for a moment before stepping back toward the door. "You don't have to like me, Dr. Lancaster," she said, "but you will respect me." Then she walked out, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do next. The next morning, Richard Lancaster did something no one expected. He walked into the nurses' station, where Amara and several of her colleagues were reviewing patient files. The conversation around them faltered when he stepped inside, the nurses exchanging cautious glances. Amara didn't look surprised. Richard cleared his throat. "May I have a moment?" Marie, standing next to Amara, looked him up and down before scoffing. "That's a first." Amara gave her a small look before nodding. "Go ahead." Richard hesitated, just for a second. Then he exhaled. "I made a mistake," he said. The silence in the room deepened. "I let my personal bias affect my judgment. And because of that, I put a patient at risk. That's not who I want to be." He met Amara's gaze. "And it won't happen again." Marie nearly dropped the clipboard she was holding. Amara didn't look impressed, nor did she look smug. She simply nodded. "Good." Richard wasn't sure what he had expected, some grand forgiveness, some moment of closure. But he realized, standing there in that quiet room, that true change didn't come in dramatic gestures. It came in moments like this. In the willingness to acknowledge fault. In the choice to do better. For the first time, he was ready to take that step. He only hoped it wasn't too late. Richard Lancaster wasn't used to feeling uncertain. For most of his life, confidence had been his armor, his shield against any challenge. But now, as he stood in the halls of St. Raphael Hospital, he realized that confidence alone wouldn't fix what he had broken. The shift in how his colleagues viewed him wasn't imagined. He could feel it, the distance, the hesitation, the lack of trust. And unlike before, when his reputation had been untouchable, now there was doubt clinging to his name like a stain. He needed to change that. But change was difficult when a lifetime of habits had molded you into someone others feared rather than respected. His first step came sooner than he expected. That afternoon, a complicated pediatric surgery was scheduled, a delicate procedure requiring steady hands and seamless teamwork. The lead nurse for the surgery? Amara Johnson. The moment he saw her name on the assignment, Richard felt the flicker of something uncomfortably close to shame. A week ago, he would have fought against having her in his OR. He would have found an excuse to replace her, to push her to the sidelines. But today, he did something different. He walked into the surgical prep room, where the team was assembling, and approached Amara directly. "Let's work together," he said simply. Amara studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. "Are you asking?" she said carefully. "Or are you ordering me?" Richard exhaled, understanding the weight behind her words. "I'm asking." She nodded. "Then let's do our jobs." And just like that, the air shifted, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in something quieter, something real. For the first time, Richard wasn't dictating, he was collaborating. And when the surgery began, something remarkable happened. They worked flawlessly together. Every movement was synchronized, every instruction received and executed without hesitation. It was as if, for those few hours, their history didn't matter. What mattered was the patient. And by the time the procedure ended successfully, Richard found himself looking at Amara with something new: respect. Richard's journey toward change was not without setbacks. The hospital was still watching him, still weighing whether his shift in attitude was genuine or merely a performance to keep his job. But Richard knew that real change wasn't about proving himself to others. It was about proving something to himself. The real test came one evening when an emergency case was rushed into the ER. A young black woman suffering from severe complications after a botched surgery at another hospital. Richard was called in for consultation. His surgical expertise needed immediately. When he entered the room, the patient's mother was holding her daughter's hand, her face tight with grief and fear. But the moment she saw Richard, her expression shifted, and he knew exactly why. She knew who he was. She had likely heard the rumors. The stories about the doctor who had humiliated a black nurse, who had let prejudice guide his decisions. And now, he was the man standing between her daughter and death. "I want another surgeon," the mother said, her voice shaking. "I don't trust him." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. There had been a time when he would have scoffed at such a reaction, when he would have dismissed it as irrational. But now he understood. And for the first time, he felt the true weight of his past actions. He could have argued. He could have insisted that he was the best choice for this surgery. But instead, he turned to Amara, who had been standing at the foot of the bed, observing everything. Without hesitation, he said, "I'll step aside if that's what you want." The mother looked surprised. So did Amara. "Dr. Johnson is one of the most capable medical professionals in this hospital," Richard continued, turning to the mother. "If you'd prefer a different team, that's your right. But I promise you this, if you let me perform this surgery, I will give your daughter the best care possible. Not because I want to prove anything, but because it's my duty as a doctor." The mother hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. And for Richard Lancaster, it was the first time in his career that trust had to be earned rather than assumed. After the surgery, a success, Richard found himself walking down the hospital corridors alone. The adrenaline had worn off, but the moment still lingered in his mind. He had spent his entire career demanding respect. Today, he had asked for it instead. And it had made all the difference. As he turned a corner, he found Amara leaning against a wall, arms crossed, waiting for him. "You surprised me today," she admitted. Richard stopped, unsure of how to respond. She sighed. "Look, I'm not going to pretend that everything's fine now. We're not suddenly friends. And I haven't forgotten everything that's happened. I don't expect you to," Richard said quietly. "But," she continued, "what you did today, that was the first real step." He swallowed, feeling something unspoken settle between them. "I don't know if I can undo everything," he admitted, "but I want to try." For the first time, Amara gave him a small, knowing smile. "Then do better," she said simply. "Every day." And then, just like that, she walked away. Richard stood there for a long time, letting her words settle. She hadn't forgiven him, but she had given him a chance. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to waste it. Months later, St. Raphael Hospital had changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no public declarations of transformation. But in the quiet, daily moments, the shift was undeniable. Doctors and nurses who had once hesitated around Richard now spoke to him more easily. His surgical team no longer worked under his shadow of intimidation, but beside him. And Amara? Amara was promoted to head nurse in the surgical department, a position she had earned. One no one could take away from her. Richard watched her from across the room during a staff meeting, noting the way people now turned to her for guidance, for leadership. She belonged here. And for the first time, he realized, so did he. Not because of his skill alone, but because he had finally learned what it meant to be a doctor. To be a leader. To be human. As the meeting ended, he approached Amara. "I heard about your promotion," he said. "Congratulations." She raised an eyebrow. "No snide remark?" He chuckled. "Not today." Amara studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thanks." And then, with the smallest hint of amusement, she added, Looks like you might actually be learning something. Richard smirked. Miracles happen. She shook her head but smiled as she walked away. And Richard Lancaster? For the first time in his life, he felt like he had finally done something right.